Mr. White over the course of the text demonstrates theme. In this lesson, you will learn how to analyze theme by following the actions of a character over the course of a text. Let's review. In a previous lesson, we determined the setting of the text. It's cold outside and warm inside. We also determined the character traits for the three major characters. Mr. White is moody and competitive, his son clever and quiet, and his wife is supportive and loyal. In this lesson, we are going to talk about themes and how the actions of a character can reflect the themes to the reader. We have to consider the choices the author made in developing the characters the way he did. Previously, we would have just thought about the characters themselves. Now we have to think about why the author would present the characters that way and what that means for us as readers. First, we are going to identify the actions of the main character in the text. Next, we are going to create a timeline of these actions. Then we will ask ourselves, how do these actions change over time? And lastly, we will ask, how do these actions mirror the theme of the text? Before we can talk about how the actions of Mr. White reflect the theme of the text, we have to be clear on what the theme is. It can be found on page 4 of the text. While I read this paragraph, I'm going to highlight what the theme is. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. As a reader, we know this is the theme of the text because it is a clear message to the reader that they are supposed to take away. Now we can rephrase the question we started with by elaborating on the theme. How do the actions of Mr. White over the course of the text reflect the theme that fate rules people's lives and should not be interfered with? The first step asks us to identify the actions of Mr. White in the text. This requires us to skim through the entire text to pinpoint all of the things that he does. Obviously, we don't have time to skim through everything now, so we are just going to identify Mr. White's major actions in the text. First, he pulls the monkey's paw from the fire. Then, he decides to keep it. He makes a wish for 200 pounds. He wishes for his son to be alive again. And he makes his final wish, the knocking stops, and the story ends. Our next step is to create a timeline of these actions. Our timeline will have a long line going horizontally with the actions plotted in order along the line. He pulls the monkey's paw from the fire, decides to keep it, wishes for 200 pounds, wishes for his son to be alive again, and then makes his final wish, which stops the knocking. For our third step, we have to ask, how did his actions change over time? If we look back at the timeline, we can see that the first 2 actions he decided all by himself. He went into the fire and he decided to keep the paw, so it seems like he really believed it could be beneficial to him and his family. With the third action, wishing for 200 pounds, which he does at the suggestion of his son, it seems like no one in his family really believes that they are going to get 200 pounds. Obviously, we then find out that the son dies, and that is how the family gets their 200 pounds. After this terrible event, Mr. White puts the paw away and tries to go on living his life, until his wife, in hysteria, forces him to wish their son alive again. He tells her it is a terrible idea, which shows a change in his attitude from earlier, when he thought the paw was fun and interesting. After making the wish and waiting, Mr. White becomes more and more convinced that only something horrible can come from the wish he's made. As the knocking begins and his wife runs to answer the door, he finds the paw and makes one last wish that stops the knocking altogether. So it looks like, at first, Mr. White likes the idea of the monkey's paw. He found it fun and interesting, but by the end of the story, he has only negative feeling towards it and the power it wields. Our last step is to ask, how do his actions mirror the theme of the text? Remember that the theme of the text is that fate rules people's lives and should not be interfered with. Thinking about our answer for step 3, we can infer that because Mr. White was so excited about the monkey's paw in the beginning, he thought that nothing would happen if he tempted fate a little. From the death of his son, however, Mr. White began to realize that messing with fate would only lead to pain and heartache, which is why he told his wife it was a bad idea to make any more wishes. By the end of the story, after he has to make his final wish, Mr. White realizes that he should never have tempted fate. Unfortunately, he learns his lesson the hard way. This brings us back to the theme of the text, which is that fate rules our lives and shouldn't be interfered with. Mr. White reflects this theme through his major actions in the text. He is at first eager to use the monkey's paw. In the middle, he is reluctant, but does it for his wife. And then at the end, he only uses it to undo what had previously been wished for, realizing that fate should not be left to mere humans to decide. Otherwise, we will be very unhappy with the outcome. We can see that the author has made specific choices in this text by developing character through these actions. Most notably, these choices help reinforce the theme of the text for the reader. In this lesson, we have identified the actions of the main character in the text. We have created a timeline of these actions. We've asked, how did these actions change over time? And we asked, how do these actions mirror the theme of the text? In this lesson, you have learned how to analyze themes by following the actions of a character over the course of a text.